My name is Elias Thorne. For as long as I can remember, my world has been defined by sound. Not the cacophony of modern life, but the delicate whispers of history, captured and preserved. I am an archivist, a custodian of echoes. My days are spent meticulously restoring forgotten recordings, coaxing voices from the past back into existence. It's a solitary life, yes, but one of profound purpose. Or so I believed. The call came on a Tuesday. My estranged grandfather, a man I barely knew, was gone. And with him, the last tenuous link to a childhood I'd long since compartmentalized. His estate, a sprawling, dilapidated Victorian house on the outskirts of town, fell to me. I remembered little of the place, only vague impressions of shadowed hallways and hushed rooms. It felt less like an inheritance and more like an obligation. The house was a mausoleum of forgotten things. Every room was a testament to a life lived in isolation, filled with dust-shrouded furniture and the scent of decay. But it was in the deepest recesses, hidden behind a false wall in what appeared to be a disused study, that I found it. A heavy, reinforced door, oddly out of place. It was locked, of course. The air inside was different, thicker, colder, carrying a faint, metallic scent I couldn't place, like old copper and something else, something dormant. A shiver traced its way down my spine, an instinctual recoil I quickly dismissed as the chill of a long, unopened space. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, filtering through a single, grimy window. And there it was, dominating the center of the soundproofed room. An antique phonograph, its brass horn tarnished but imposing. Around it, stacked neatly on shelves, were dozens, perhaps hundreds, of unlabeled wax cylinders. My professional curiosity ignited. This was a rare find, a treasure trove for someone like me. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool, smooth surface of the phonograph. For a fleeting second, in the polished brass, I saw a reflection that wasn't my own. A gaunt, distorted face, gone before I could properly register it. My mind, ever rational, attributed it to poor light and tired eyes. I selected a cylinder, my hand steady despite the lingering chill in the air. I placed it on the spindle, lowered the needle. The mechanism whirred to life. But then, instead of the expected crackle of static, the machine coughed, groaned, and began to play backwards. A garbled, guttural sound, like a strangled cry, filled the small room, deeply unsettling and profoundly wrong. My heart jumped. Before I could react, it lurched, corrected itself, and then, only then, did the familiar, faint static begin to hum. A mechanical hiccup, I told myself. Just an old machine, protesting its long slumber. But as the low, almost imperceptible static filled the soundproof space, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had just tried to speak. And it wasn't a voice from the past. It was something far older, far more hungry. My work had just begun. The backward playback of the phonograph had been a fluke, a glitch in ancient machinery. I told myself that repeatedly as I spent the next few days in the soundproofed room, meticulously cleaning and preparing the first batch of cylinders. My archivist's mind craved order, logic. The faint static that hummed from the grooves was just the expected degradation of time, nothing more. But as I began the painstaking process of digitizing them, the static began to shift. It wasn't uniform. There were undulations, subtle shifts in frequency that hinted at something beneath the hiss. I adjusted the filters, enhanced the audio, convinced I was merely revealing the true, albeit damaged, nature of the original recordings. Then came the whispers, fragmented, distorted, like voices trapped underwater. My first thought was pareidolia, the brain imposing patterns on random noise. A trick of the mind, a product of my own isolation. I heard what sounded like pleas, faint screams, desperate, choked words. Help me, one seemed to gasp. barely audible above the crackle. Another, a low, mournful moan. I dismissed them as auditory illusions, remnants of old sound bleeding through, or perhaps even the faint echoes of the house itself. But the unease began to chip away at my rational facade. The whispers became clearer, more distinct. One evening, as I focused on a particularly degraded cylinder, a voice, raspy and raw, seemed to articulate a single word with chilling clarity. Elias, my breath hitched. It was my name. I froze, my hand hovering over the photograph. It had to be a coincidence, a common sound that my mind, already strained, had interpreted as personal. Yet, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder, despite the lack of a draft. The subtle phenomena in the house began. A fleeting shadow in my peripheral vision, just at the edge of the hallway, gone the moment I turned my head. A sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature that would send a shiver through me, only to vanish moments later. The feeling of being watched, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, even when I was alone in a brightly lit room. I told myself it was the old house settling, my imagination working overtime in the quiet solitude. I noticed a pattern emerging in the recordings. A recurring distorted sound, almost like a choked gasp or a wet cough, appeared on several different cylinders, regardless of the apparent source of the voice. It was too specific to be random noise. This wasn't just degradation. It was a signature. One afternoon, while examining the phonograph more closely, searching for any mechanical fault that might explain the backward playback, my fingers brushed against something small, hard, and rough, tucked deep within the casing, near the needle arm. I pulled it out. It was a crudely carved wooden doll, no bigger than my thumb, fashioned from dark, aged wood. Its features were rudimentary, but unsettling. 2 hollowed-out eyes and a tiny, almost imperceptible hole where its mouth should be. It felt strangely warm, as if it had been recently held. An inexplicable urge, a morbid curiosity, compelled me to put my ear to that tiny hole. I heard nothing, of course, but the silence that followed was louder than any scream. This wasn't just an old machine. This house, and the cylinders within it, held secrets far stranger than I could have imagined. My rational world was starting to crumble. The wooden doll, with its silent, gaping mouth, sat on my desk, a constant, unsettling presence. I tried to ignore it, to focus on my work, but the whispers from the cylinders were no longer content to be mere background noise. They demanded attention. The static had thinned, revealing a horrifying clarity. These weren't fragmented phrases anymore. These were coherent, terrifying narratives. I heard the gasping struggle of woman drowning, her final desperate bubbles of breath caught in the wax, the sickening thud and subsequent silence of a body hitting the ground from a great height, the ragged, choked cries of someone fighting for their life, ending abruptly with a wet, tearing sound. Each recording was a visceral, horrifying tableau of a final moment, filled with genuine terror and despair. There was no mistaking it now. These were not actors. This was not coincidence. These were the sounds of death. My scientific detachment, once my fortress, began to crumble. My hands trembled as I handled the cylinders, each one feeling heavy with unspoken agony. How was this possible? How could such raw, unadulterated terror be captured, preserved, and played back with such chilling fidelity? My mind, desperate for a logical explanation, cycled through theories, elaborate hoaxes, a forgotten, macabre art project. But the sheer, agonizing authenticity of the screams defied all reason. The house, in turn, seemed to respond to my listening. The subtle phenomena intensified, no longer fleeting or easily dismissed. Objects began to move. A heavy book would slide off a shelf with a soft thud when I wasn't looking directly at it. A teacup would inexplicably shatter in the kitchen, despite being untouched. Whispers, no longer confined to the recordings, would emanate directly behind me, cold and breathy, sometimes mimicking my own name, sometimes a name I didn't recognize, always laced with a malevolent glee. The oppressive presence I'd felt before solidified, a constant, unseen weight pressing down on me. Sleep offered no escape. My nights became a torturous echo chamber of the recordings. I would dream of drowning, the water filling my lungs, the frantic struggle for air. I would dream of falling, the ground rushing up to meet me, the sickening impact. I would wake in a cold sweat, gasping, the sounds of the dead still ringing in my ears, blurring the lines between nightmare and reality. My isolation deepened. I stopped answering calls, ignored emails. The outside world felt distant, irrelevant, compared to the horrors unfolding within these walls. One particularly stormy evening, as rain lashed against the windows and thunder rattled the old house, I was digitizing a recording of a particularly harrowing drowning. The victims' pleas were agonizingly clear, their final gurgles almost unbearable. I was hunched over the phonograph, headphones clamped to my ears, when suddenly the house plunged into darkness. The storm had knocked out the power. My heart leaped into my throat. The sudden, absolute blackness was disorienting, suffocating. I ripped off the headphones, but the sounds of the drowning didn't stop. They were no longer coming from the phonograph. They were in the room with me. The sound of rushing water, of desperate, flailing limbs, of a body sinking into the depths. Then I felt it. Cold, wet hands, not just one, but several, grasping at my ankles, my calves, pulling. A primal scream tore from my throat as I thrashed, kicking wildly, stumbling backward. The air grew impossibly cold, the metallic scent from the soundproofed room now overpowering. I felt something large and heavy collide with my leg. Then, with a blinding flash and a crackle, the power flickered back on. I gasped, my eyes wide, my body trembling. The room was illuminated, though dimly. The phonograph stood undisturbed. But across the floor, my heavy, antique armchair, a solid piece of oak, lay violently overturned. Its velvet cushions splayed, as if something had ripped it from its place and thrown it. My breath hitched. This was no longer just a feeling or a whisper. This was real. The house was alive, and it was angry. Or perhaps something within it was. The overturned armchair was undeniable. A physical manifestation of the horror, a violent punctuation mark on my crumbling sanity. It wasn't just whispers and shadows anymore. Something in this house, or rather from these recordings, was capable of physical force. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through my archivist's detachment. I couldn't dismiss it. I couldn't rationalize it. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The only logical place to start was with the man who had left me this cursed inheritance, my grandfather. I abandoned the soundproof room for a time, leaving the phonograph and its cylinders behind like a nest of vipers. Instead, I turned my attention to the rest of the house, particularly my grandfather's study, a room I had barely touched, filled with the musty scent of old paper and forgotten ambitions. I began to sift through his belongings, not as an heir, but as a desperate detective. Beneath stacks of mundane documents and dusty academic papers, I found them, his hidden journals. Bound in worn leather, their pages filled with cramped, erratic handwriting that grew increasingly frantic with each entry. These weren't the musings of a retired scholar. They were the obsessive records of a man consumed. My grandfather, it turned out, wasn't just a recluse. He was a disgraced parapsychologist, shunned by his peers for his unorthodox and increasingly disturbing theories. The journals detailed his lifelong obsession, capturing residual energy and echoes of the departed through sound. He believed that extreme emotional states, particularly those experienced at the moment of death, left an indelible sonic imprint on the environment. He wasn't just collecting sounds, he was trying to trap them. His early experiments were academic, if eccentric, but as the entries progressed, they grew darker more unhinged. He spoke of resonance amplification, of harmonic conduits, and of the ultimate truth, waiting to be unlocked by those brave enough to listen. Interspersed with his chilling hypotheses were newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle. They all focused on a local tragedy from decades ago, a series of unexplained disappearances. Young men and women vanished without a trace. The police had no leads. The community was terrified. My grandfather's annotations in the margins were chilling dates, locations, cryptic symbols that seemed to correspond to the very recordings I had been digitizing. A cold dread settled in my stomach. The voices I had heard, the agonizing final moments, they were the missing. I stumbled upon a faded photograph tucked into one of the later journals. It showed my grandfather, younger, but with the same intense, almost manic gleam in his eyes, standing with a group of people. My blood ran cold. One of the faces, a young woman with a distinctive birthmark, was unmistakably the voice I had heard droning, her pleas still echoing in my nightmares. But in the photograph, her eyes had been crudely, violently scratched out, leaving two jagged black holes. Another figure in the background, a man, had a disturbing, unnatural smile, stretched too wide, too thin. It was a grotesque distortion, as if someone had defaced the image with a sick joke. Then, buried beneath a pile of his more esoteric texts, I found a small, locked wooden box. Inside, not more journals, but a series of letters. They were exchanges between my grandfather and a Dr. Alistair Finch, a renowned but controversial linguist from a distant university. My grandfather's letters were filled with technical jargon about sound wave manipulation, specific frequencies, and the psychoacoustic properties of terror. Finch's replies, initially skeptical, grew increasingly fascinated, discussing not just the capture of sound, but its potential to alter consciousness and even chillingly to summon something from beyond the veil of perception. They theorized about using specific sonic patterns to create a vibrational bridge. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather wasn't just a collector of morbid curiosities. He wasn't just a misguided academic. He was a monster. He hadn't simply stumbled upon these recordings. He had engineered them. The missing people weren't accidental victims. They were subjects. The voices from the other side weren't passive echoes of the dead. They were active conduits, perhaps even instruments of his twisted experiments. The house, I realized, was not just haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by a deliberate, scientific malevolence, a legacy of depravity far more terrifying than any phantom. The whispers in my head, the cold hands, the overturned furniture, they weren't just residual energy. They were the responses of something trapped, something that had been awakened, and it was now turning its attention to me. The revelation of my grandfather's monstrous legacy was a hammer blow to my already fractured mind. He wasn't just obsessed. He was a murderer, a twisted scientist who had engineered terror to capture the very essence of death. The voices from the other side weren't ghosts. They were the tormented consciousnesses of his victims, trapped, amplified, and now actively seeking something from me. The house, once merely eerie, now felt like a living tomb, every shadow a potential threat, every creak a whispered accusation. My descent into madness accelerated. The whispers, once confined to the soundproofed room, bled into every corner of my waking life. They were no longer faint or distorted. They were clear, insidious, and deeply personal. They mimicked the voices of people I knew, people I missed, my mother, a childhood friend, even my own voice, but laced with a chilling malevolence. "You're just like him, Ilias," a voice that sounded eerily like my late mother would croon from the empty hallway. "You hear us now, don't you? You understand." They gave me unsettling commands, subtle at first, then more direct. "Go back to the room, Ilias. Listen closer. Don't trust the light. The truth is in the dark." They seemed to know my deepest fears, my insecurities, twisting them, amplifying them until paranoia became my constant companion. I started seeing things, fleeting figures in my peripheral vision that solidified into the gaunt, terrified faces from the photograph before dissolving into smoke. The walls seemed to breathe, the patterns on the wallpaper shifting into grotesque visages. I was being watched, manipulated, my every thought and action seemingly guided by the unseen chorus of the dead. I isolated myself completely. The outside world became a distant, meaningless hum. I stopped eating properly, my body fueled only by adrenaline and fear. Sleep, when it came, was a battlefield of waking nightmares, where the victim's final moments played out around me in vivid, agonizing detail. I couldn't distinguish reality from the influence of the recordings, or perhaps the influence of what my grandfather had truly unleashed. In a desperate, fleeting moment of clarity, a final attempt to anchor myself to sanity, I reached for my phone. There was only one person I still vaguely trusted, a former colleague, Sarah, who had once shared my passion for audio preservation. My hands trembled as I dialed her number. The phone rang, once, twice. "Elias, are you okay? I've been worried sick." Her voice, calm and concerned, was a lifeline. But then it happened. A sudden burst of static, not from the phone, but from within the room, loud enough to make me flinch. Sarah's voice was drowned out by a cacophony of whispers. "She knows too much, Elias. She tell them. Don't trust her. She's not real." The voices were layered, overlapping, some shrieking, some hissing, revealing deeply personal, secret fears of mine that Sarah could never have known. "Remember your father's accident, Elias? You could have stopped it. You're alone. Always alone." The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering to the floor. I stared at it, horrified, the voices still swirling around me, now mocking, triumphant. I had tried to reach out, and they had punished me for it. Sarah was in danger because of me. I was truly irrevocably alone. Later that night, the house was silent, save for the incessant buzzing in my ears. I was in the soundproofed room, drawn back to the phonograph by an irresistible, terrifying compulsion. My eyes scanned the shelves, counting the cylinders, trying to make sense of the chaos. And then I saw it. On the phonograph's platter, where I had left nothing, was a new, unlabeled wax cylinder. It was pristine, untouched by dust, almost glowing in the dim light. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it hadn't been there moments before. My hands, though trembling, moved on their own. I placed the cylinder on the spindle, lowered the needle. The familiar crackle filled the air, but then a voice began to play. It was distorted, laced with static, pleading, terrified. And it was my own voice. "Please, no, don't let me out." My own voice from a few days prior, perhaps even from moments ago, captured, trapped, screaming for release. I stared at the phonograph, my reflection in its brass horn, now a gaunt, hollow-eyed stranger. I wasn't just listening to the recordings of the dead. I was becoming one of them. My own voice, distorted and pleading, trapped on a wax cylinder. It was the ultimate violation, the final, undeniable proof that my sanity was unraveling, and that my grandfather's insidious work was claiming me. The horror wasn't just external. It was internal, a parasitic infection of my very being. I was becoming one of the recordings of the dead, a living echo of their suffering. A desperate, primal instinct for survival surged through the terror. I couldn't succumb. I wouldn't. There was only one way out of this nightmare. I had to either complete my grandfather's work, understand it fully to control it, or destroy the source of this torment. The latter seemed impossible, given the insidious nature of the influence, but the former. The thought of delving deeper into his depravity was repellent, yet offered a perverse promise of control. I returned to the soundproofed room, no longer as a meticulous archivist, but as a man on the precipice, driven by a terrifying resolve. My eyes, bloodshot and wide, scanned the remaining cylinders. The voices, even without the phonograph playing, were a constant hum in my ears. A chorus of whispers, some pleading, some mocking, all urging me on. Listen, Elias, listen to us. Find the truth. He awaits you. As I listened, no longer just to individual cries, but to the collective agony, a chilling pattern began to emerge. It wasn't random. The recordings, when pieced together, formed a grotesque narrative, a timeline of my grandfather's victims, each cylinder a chapter in their final moments. It was a symphony of despair, orchestrated by a madman. The realization made my stomach churn, but it also gave me a twisted sense of purpose. There had to be a final movement, a conclusion to this unholy composition. My gaze fell upon a section of the shelf I hadn't properly examined, hidden behind a false back panel, revealed only by a faint, almost imperceptible scene. My grandfather's meticulous concealment, a final, cruel flourish. My fingers, trembling with a mixture of dread and morbid anticipation, pried it open. And there it was, a single, dark, unplayed cylinder, nestled in a velvet-lined compartment. It felt colder than the others, radiating an almost palpable sense of dread. This was it, the final recording, the crescendo. As I reached for it, the house erupted. It was no longer subtle creaks or fleeting shadows. The soundproofed room, designed to contain sound, now amplified it. Disembodied screams tore through the air, piercing and raw, echoing the agony I'd heard on the recordings, but now seemingly uncontained. Objects began to fly, books hurled from shelves, the heavy armchair from Chapter 3 violently spinning across the room, slamming into the wall. The air crackled with a cold, malevolent energy. Shadowy figures, vaguely human, coalesced in the corners of my vision. They weren't just fleeting glimpses now. They were distinct, gaunt forms, their faces indistinct, but their agony palpable. One figure, taller than the others, its form shimmering with static, reached out a spectral hand towards me. I instinctively recoiled, but it was too fast. Its icy fingers brushed my forearm, leaving behind a searing, burning mark, a circular welt that mirrored the strange, discolored wound described in one of the drowning victim's recordings. The pain was sharp, but the horror was deeper. They were touching me. They were real. The voices reached a deafening crescendo, a horrifying chorus of screams, pleas, and guttural roars. And then a new voice joined them, amplified and impossibly distorted. A voice I recognized from the journals, now twisted into something monstrous. My grandfather's. Play it, Elias. Play it. Clarity awaits. Peace. He roared, his voice a distorted echo of his former self, now part of the symphony of the damned. They wanted me to play the final cylinder. They promised clarity, peace, an end to the torment. But I knew their promises were a lie. They wanted a conduit. Just as my hand hovered over the final cylinder, about to place it on the phonograph, the reinforced front door of the house, miles away, violently burst open. A deafening crack rent the air, followed by the sound of splintering wood. A swirling vortex of static and absolute darkness materialized in the doorway, a gaping maw of pure void. From its depths, the combined voices of all the recordings shrieked in unison, a single, agonizing roar that resonated through the very foundations of the house. The vortex pulsed, a terrifying gravitational pull attempting to drag me towards it, towards the ultimate, inescapable horror. The choice was no longer just about the recordings. It was about my very soul. The vortex pulsed, a gaping maw of static and darkness, shrieked with the combined agony of the dead, attempting to pull me into its depths. My grandfather's distorted roar echoed through the maelstrom. Play it, Elias. Play it. Clarity awaits. Peace. Every fiber of my being screamed to flee, to run from this house, this nightmare. But a terrifying resolve, born of desperation and a twisted sense of duty solidified within me. There was no escape from this, only through it. I had to know. I had to play the final cylinder. With a guttural cry, I fought against the unseen pull, my feet scraping against the floorboards. My hand, still burning from the spectral touch, reached for the dark, unplayed cylinder. The house bucked around me, objects flying, shadowy figures swirling, their forms vaguely resembling the victims, whose voices I now knew so intimately. Ignoring the chaos, ignoring the searing pain in my arm, I slammed the final cylinder onto the phonograph's spindle. The needle, a tiny, fragile point, descended into the groove. A low, resonant hum filled the soundproofed room, cutting through the shrieking vortex and the cacophony of voices. Then, my grandfather's voice, clear at first, then slowly distorting, filled the air. It was calm, chillingly rational, utterly devoid of remorse. "Elias," he began, his voice a spectral echo of the man in the journals. "If you hear this, then you have found my magnum opus. You have listened. You have understood. They called me mad. They called me a monster. But I merely sought the ultimate truth, the final resonance of consciousness." My blood ran cold. He paused, a sickening, almost gleeful chuckle resonating through the recording. "I didn't just record the dead, Elias. That was merely a means to an end. I created them. The moment of extreme terror, the instant of transition from life to death. It is then that the soul, its unique vibrational signature, is most potent, most resonant. The missing people, the disappearances the newspapers bemoaned, they were my subjects. Each one, a carefully orchestrated experiment in capturing the purest echo of a departing consciousness. As his confession unfolded, the room around me seemed to dissolve. I was no longer in the soundproof study, but plunged into a horrifying, kaleidoscopic vision. I saw vivid, agonizing flashes of the murders. The young woman from the photograph, her face contorted in terror as water filled her lungs, her final bubbles rising around me. The sickening crunch of bone as another victim plummeted from a great height, the ground rushing up, then darkness. The desperate, futile struggle of a third, a knife glinting, a wet, tearing sound that echoed the very recording I had heard. I was experiencing their deaths, reliving their final, agonizing moments, a silent participant in my grandfather's atrocities. The voices from the other cylinders, the ones I had painstakingly digitized, roared to life around me, no longer just echoes, but direct, furious accusations. "You knew!" shrieked the drowning woman, her spectral face appearing inches from mine, water streaming from her eyes. "You let him. You're complicit." Another voice, raw with agony, screamed, "Release us. Please, Elias, release us from this torment." They clawed at me, their phantom hands leaving burning trails on my skin, their pleas morphing into demands, their despair into a furious, vengeful rage. Then, a new apparition materialized before me, coalescing from the swirling static and shadows. It was my grandfather, not as I remembered him, but as he appeared in the later photographs, gaunt, eyes burning with manic triumph. He stood there, spectral and translucent, yet utterly solid in his malevolence, his form shimmering with the same static that now plagued my mind. He smiled, a wide, grotesque grin that stretched his features unnaturally. "They are trapped, Elias," he gloated, his voice resonating from his spectral form, layered over the recording, bound to the frequencies, forever echoing my triumph. The confession on the cylinder continued, his voice now laced with a chilling excitement. And the ultimate prize, Elias, was not merely to record. It was to transcend, to transfer consciousness, to live beyond the frailties of flesh, to inhabit a new vessel, amplified by the resonant echoes of the departed, to become more. The phonograph crackled, and my grandfather's recorded voice faded, replaced by a new sound, a faint, distorted whisper. It was the voice of the young woman from the drowning recording, her voice filled with a chilling, triumphant despair. "He succeeded, Elias," she hissed, her voice now emanating from the phonograph, from the spectral grandfather, and from the very air around me. "He found his way. He is here, waiting, in the static, in the silence, in you." The true horror crashed down on me. It wasn't about ghosts. It was about human depravity, a scientific madness that had twisted life and death into a grotesque experiment. My grandfather hadn't just created victims. He had become one with his monstrous creation, his consciousness intertwined with the very recordings that now tormented me. And I, Elias Thorne, had become his unwitting heir, a potential new conduit for his unspeakable legacy. The voices from the other side were not just the dead. They were him, and they were waiting. The truth resonated through me like a corrupted chord, vibrating every nerve, every thought. My grandfather, a monster who had engineered terror, had also found a way to transcend, to transfer his consciousness, to become one with the very echoes he had created. And now, the chilling whisper from the phonograph, from the spectral grandfather, from the very air, confirmed it. He is here, waiting, in the static, in the silence, in you. I was not just Elias Thorne, archivist. I was a potential new vessel, a horrifying continuation of his legacy. The vortex in the doorway shrieked, a hungry void. The spectral figures of the victims clawed at me, their pleas for release now desperate, their rage palpable. My grandfather's translucent form loomed, his grotesque smile widening, urging me to embrace the clarity, the peace that awaited. I stood at the precipice, faced with an agonizing choice: succumb to the influence, become the conduit, allow his monstrous consciousness to fully inhabit me, or fight, destroy the cylinders, release the tormented souls, and perhaps release myself from this unspeakable curse. A flicker of defiance, a desperate spark of the old Elias, ignited within the encroaching madness. I would not be his vessel. I would not be his instrument. With a primal roar that tore my throat, I lunged at the phonograph. The spectral forms shrieked, the vortex pulsed violently, but I ignored them, my focus absolute. My hands, burning with the phantom touch, seized the cylinders one by one. They were surprisingly fragile. With each snap, each sickening crunch of wax under my grip, a wave of distorted sound erupted. A final, agonizing scream, a burst of static, then silence. The spectral figures writhed, their forms flickering, dissolving into wisps of smoke. The vortex in the doorway pulsed erratically, shrinking, its shriek diminishing to a dying gasp. I smashed them, one after another, against the floor, against the walls, until the soundproofed room was littered with shattered fragments of wax, each one a testament to a life brutally ended, and a torment finally, mercifully released. As the last cylinder shattered, a profound silence descended upon the house. The vortex in the doorway vanished, the spectral forms gone. The air, once thick with dread, felt lighter, though still impossibly cold. I stood amidst the debris, gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably, the burning mark on my arm throbbing with a dull ache. I had done it. I had destroyed the source. I had released them. But the silence was not peace. It was a hollow, echoing void. The experience had irrevocably shattered my mind. The whispers, though no longer external, still hummed within my skull, a persistent, low static that never truly faded. Sometimes, in the dead of night, they would coalesce into faint, distorted sentences, revealing new, horrifying details about my grandfather's experiments, details I couldn't have known, details that suggested a part of his consciousness, or perhaps one of the victims, had indeed transferred, not into a cylinder, but into me. The final days in the house were a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I packed nothing, simply walked out, leaving the mausoleum of horrors behind. The authorities found me wandering miles away, incoherent, muttering about voices and static. They found the empty, silent house, the shattered wax, but no bodies, no proof of the atrocities. They called it a breakdown, a psychotic episode triggered by isolation and grief. I am now institutionalized, or perhaps living in a self-imposed isolation. A quiet room with padded walls. They say I am recovering. They say the hallucinations will fade, but they don't know. They don't hear the constant, low static that hums beneath my thoughts. They don't hear the faint whispers that sometimes, just sometimes, form coherent words. My lips move. Not my voice, not Elias's voice. A new voice, faint, distorted, but undeniably present. Whispers from my mouth. A voice from the other side. A voice that was never on a cylinder. A voice that found its ultimate vessel. The old Victorian house stands empty on the outskirts of town, a silent monument to a monstrous legacy. Its windows are dark, its doors sealed. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, or when the night is particularly still, a faint, almost imperceptible static can be heard, carried on the breeze. And if you listen very, very closely, you might just hear a whisper, a promise that the voices from the other side are never truly silenced. They just find a new way to resonate.